And it looks like we are live here. I'm here with Mike Korn. Hey, Mike.
Hey, greetings.
Now, Mike is, I should point out, Mike is one of my closest friends, but he's also a contributor. We contribute to each other's stuff all the time. But we're here today mainly, we'll get on to other stuff, I'm sure, but mainly to talk about his article or his story in Lifeblood 2, which is a collection of vampire stories. And we'll talk about that and then just sort of go off from there and springboard and see where we wind up. If you guys have caught any of these chats, you know that they can go just about anywhere depending on where it gets taken, which I kind of like that. You don't know what you're going to get when you sign in. So also, I should point out, I've already mentioned this to Mike, sometimes my USB port goes wonky on me. If that happens, I'll drop out, but I'll come back in. So, yeah. So anyway, Mike, let's talk about your story. Why don't you give people a little bit of a rundown of what you wrote? I mean, let me just say it originally was featured in Wormwood Chronicles, and I remembered reading it at the time. But Wormwood is one of Mike's things, and I contribute to it. And I remember reading it at the time it was published. And then when I got thinking about doing an article on Elizabeth Bathory, I was thinking he had done one specifically on that. And when I got digging around, it turns out it was actually, that was only part of the article. So I asked Mike if we could use it in here, and he said, yeah. So let's talk about it, Mike.
Okay, yeah, I kind of wanted to bring to light some real life vampire tale. It's not a fictional thing. It's a report on historical events and possibly some of the ones that are less well known. Elizabeth Bathory was a very, very well known tale of a real life vampire or a woman who basically was close enough to the real thing that the difference didn't matter. I kind of focused on the story of a Polish immigrant named Demetrius Mayakura, who died in the early 70s, and he literally died through fear of vampires. He was so obsessed with staying safe from vampires who he thought were after him in real life that he wound up choking to death on a piece of garlic. And when the police found his body, his apartment, let's say, was a very strange thing to stumble on. It was the domain of somebody who was like the ultimate vampirophobic person. They found him basically, he had garlic all over the place, crosses. He surrounded his bed with newspapers so that way if nobody could sneak up on him. There were dishes full of salt and urine all over the place. Other dishes with human waste and garlic mixed together. And these were all the anti vampire techniques from the rural Polish village that he was born in. He lived in England for over 40 years and was a complete cipher to his neighbors. Had no friends, no family, did basically landscaping and garden work, and went back to his room at night and he had no electrical hookup. He could have, but everything was done by candlelight. So it was a guy who resisted completely the modern world, and his fear of vampires finally cost him his life.
Kind of ironic. He's trying to protect himself and save his life.
Yeah, it was a gruesome scene when the police came in. I mean, his body was completely contorted, eyes were open, his mouth was agape, and all this paraphernalia. I'm sure the cops were completely baffled by what they'd seen at first. But that's one of the more well known, well, I won't say well known cases because you have to dig for it. but let's say it's a well documented case.
Right. And so I can't remember were there other ones in there or no? Was it just mainly that one? And
Well,
then
I also wrote a little bit on the famous story of the Belgrade Vampire in the 1730s, which is a documented case. If you go to the police records and you go far back enough, you will see affidavits and reports on this case. And that was an instance where policemen from Belgrade in Yugoslavia, I don't know if it was Yugoslavia at the time because the borders have changed a lot over the years, but they considered themselves like very worldly cops trying to use scientific or normal methods. They got called out to a rural village that was plagued by a vampire, by vampiric killings. And they documented the case very well, which you could still find. But there was a farmer in the local area that committed suicide. And in European folklore, suicide is usually a gateway to becoming a vampire or some sort of a cursed creature. And this farmer's family found themselves dying and suffering from plagues and wasting diseases. And it wasn't too long before the village said, oh, the old boy is back from the grave. And usually vampires also in folklore, they first people they prey on is their own family. That's a common theme in a lot of the European vampire folklore. Well, these police went and they looked into it and interviewed people, and they were prepared to say, well, this is probably some sort of a crank. They wound up digging up the grave. And I regret to say I can't remember how long it was after the guy had died, but it had been a fairly significant period of time. They dug up the body, disinterred that, opened the coffin, and the police were just aghast at what they saw. This guy's body was in there. It had not really corrupted at all or decayed, but it looked pretty ghastly. I mean, he had grown hair since he'd been buried. His fingernails had grown. Uh, his eyes were wide open, according to all the reports. That the method to take care of a vampire in that place at that time was an iron stake through the heart, followed by a decapitation. And the police, after seeing the condition of the body, said, "Go ahead. You won't have any argument from us." And they staked the guy, and apparently he groaned, and blood and some sort of viscous white substance came out of the body and then was reburied. And the police went back to Belgrade and filed their report. And of course, the bosses didn't know what to make of it. And I don't know if it had a career effect on any of the police or the investigators, but it was well known, the details of the case. Now, some say there might have been a condition. This guy's body might have been in a 1 in a million condition of some kind. In other words, a legitimate scientific explanation. But I sincerely doubt anybody who saw the body that night probably was thinking of that. So, yeah, that was a unique case, probably as close as we can get to of a real life supernatural vampire that was recorded by proper legal means and not just folklore or hearsay or wives' tales. So that and the story of Demetrius Mayakura, I would say those were the main focuses of what I wrote. I talked about some others. I talked a little about John George High, who was called the Vampire Killer and the Acid Killer in England. He had disposed of his victims in a tub with acid, drank some of their blood, and was an infamous killer in England. Not so well known in the United States. They did theorize that his blood drinking was almost might have been part of an attempt to make people think that he was insane. He used the insanity defense.
Wow.
You know, I don't know. I'm pretty sure. Let me take a look here real quick, but I'm pretty sure they executed him, and he was probably one of the last people executed in England because they have done away with capital punishment. But let me just take a quick look here and see what I can find. Yeah. Well, it doesn't. It doesn't quite give me the legal result. I can look that up for you. I'm sure it's pretty easy because that was a well-known case.
Yeah.
But he was not the only killer to drink blood. I suspect that's actually been over the centuries a fairly common thing to happen.
Well, there were a lot of superstitions about drinking blood. Plus, there were one of the things because I actually did a full thing on Elizabeth Bathory, and she, as it turns out, there's a lot more to that story than what everybody gets, and some of it may literally have been just made up because the king owed her husband money, and really by locking her up and everything, he got out of the debt that he owed. So he had um, a real motive to do that. But one of the things with her was she had epilepsy, and at the time, one of the things that they thought would cure epilepsy was either drinking or rubbing on your lips blood and or brain matter from dead people. And so I'm sure she did some of that for that very reason. And there were a lot of superstitions with blood at the time.
Well, she was initiated into this by some of her servants.
Yeah.
That's a part of course, they get tortured and hung
Oh
and
yeah.
executed. But her being part of a noble family was basically bricked up.
Yeah.
Which it's hard to say if that's any easier a way to go.
Well, and they said that they're not actually, there are conflicting reports. Some say she was bricked up in her room. Others say that she was just not allowed to leave her castle. And so it's hard to tell which report was true or which one wasn't. But
I've heard more than a few about the fact that she was imprisoned in her chamber.
yeah,
It yeah, and some of the those were harsh times.
oh yeah,
And there were a lot of cruel people in that part of the world. I mean, the methods they used to execute and torture the servants were probably just as bad as the crimes themselves.
oh yeah,
Uh, but the body count on that is always, I've always heard different things, but it was a lot.
yeah, and it was mostly all young girls.
Mm-hmm. And the peasants didn't have much of a chance
No,
to fight the nobility. But
no,
this was a case that was so extreme that it caused a virtual uprising in the local villages. It just couldn't be ignored any longer. They probably ignored it at first. It's like, I don't know if you're familiar with Gilda Ray, who was probably made Elizabeth Bathory look like Maud or Rhoda. But he was close to Joan of Arc. He was very close to being a pope at one time. He committed atrocious acts on young boys by the hundreds. The band Celtic Frost did a song about him, In the Crypt of Rays. And a lot of people said, well, what do they mean? Rays from the sun, rays from the moon? No, it was Gilda-Rays. That was his crypt.
Oh,
And
wow.
and if you haven't heard about him, you should look him up, because he was certainly one of the most evil characters in history, and was accused of devil worship, and perhaps some of that was propaganda, but it was a grotesque case, and it kind of Elizabeth Bathory's case kind of reminded me of him in a ways. I don't know if he was vampiric to the point of drinking blood, but he did terrible things to these kids once they were dead.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
So I have the question. You're both a student of history, and you have a big interest in cryptids, which in a way I would consider vampires to be cryptids. Do you believe in vampires, actually? You think there ever have been real supernatural vampires?
I think probably not really. Not with powers to turn into a bat or a cloud of mist. Uh, there could have been some sort of peculiar disease or physical mutation that might have caused some of this, and the stories over time blow into exaggeration. I wouldn't believe in a true supernatural vampire that most people accept, but that doesn't mean that vampiric crimes and vampiric atrocities haven't happened.
Right.
Um, you'd speak about cryptids that drink blood. Well, that's the chupacabra, which is the creature of Latin America and Puerto
Right.
Rico. And there's a lot of weird misinformation about that, but at its core, that was an animal that drank blood, not so much from humans, but from
Right.
livestock and animals. Uh, I
Well,
know.
there's certainly plenty of real life animals that drink blood. I mean, obviously you got mosquitoes,
Oh
and
yeah.
then you've got vampire bats, which typically don't feed on humans, but they will feed on livestock. And
A vampire bat is much more dangerous by rabies and by
yes,
blood drinking. The amount of blood that they drink, unless there's a whole flock of them, which I've never heard of, wouldn't really kill uh,
right.
like a cow or a goat or anything like that. Maybe a little small animal it would, but the rabies is the big difference with them.
Well, one thing I find interesting is I don't know if you've read Dan Clefstead's book Fiona's Guardians, but it's a really good vampire book that he did recently. And one of the points that he brought up in there is that the vampires tend to prefer different blood types. Different vampires like different blood types more than others. The funny thing is, there's actually a precedent for that in nature, because I was reading recently that they think that mosquitoes prefer certain blood types to other blood types.
Imagine it's a smorgasbord, they'll buzz and say, ooh, this guy, type O. No, sir.
Yeah, so they're more attracted. They can smell different blood types, and they're more attracted to different blood types.
Well, yeah, that's interesting. No, I'm not familiar with that book. I'm going to tell you, just by, I don't know, coincidence, but I started watching a vampire movie that's kind of unique that I'm watching right now from the 50s. You may have seen it since you watch Swanguli a lot. And I think it's been on there at least once. Curse of the Undead, it's
Oh,
called. And it's
yeah,
a vampire western.
yes. It's actually a lot of people hate it. I think it's pretty fun.
I think it's original,
Yeah,
very original look at the case. I mean, I was just watching it not that long ago, and the vampire outlaw, I guess, has got a very interesting backstory, and also some interesting differences where he can tolerate the sunlight. He doesn't like it that much, but he can tolerate it and operate in it. So they kind of create their own mythology. I've known it as a cult film. I would imagine if I would have saw it when I was a small kid, I probably would have been disappointed because at least in the early part, the Western parts are stronger than the horror parts. But
Right.
now I watch it and I appreciate it for doing something different with the story. It actually makes sense. A vampire is kind of an outlaw that drifts from town to town. He'd be the ultimate hired gun since nobody can kill him,
Right.
with a bullet. I think he gets killed in the end by a bullet that has a cross etched onto it.
Right.
If I remember. I haven't got that far yet, but by coincidence, I was watching that earlier in the week. So you got to remember there's a lot of the Hollywood vampires are different than the folklore vampires.
Oh yeah, and what I've found and what I've tried to do in my vampire stories is I found that most people have their own sort of hierarchy of rules and stuff to the unique to their own fiction. My stories, I've been building a lot of vampire stories over the years, and they all have an internal connection. There are certain rules, like mine. My vampires can go out in the sunlight again, just like that. They don't like it, and the longer you've been a vampire, the stronger you are, the more you can take it.
Yeah.
But you lose any extra power by going out in the sunlight, and when you're really fresh to it, you get very sick. But you can do it. You don't burn up and die. I heard that burning up and dying was literally first shown in Nosferatu, and before that, it never existed in vampire fiction.
Well, yeah, and in Nosferatu, he literally turned into a puff of smoke.
Yeah,
At the first ray of dawn.
yeah,
So there's so many different kinds of vampire folklore across all cultures. I would never want to say that there isn't one that's allergic to sunlight,
right,
but they have some strange variations. I mean, the Chinese vampire is a hopping vampire. They hop up and down. They can't walk.
Oh wow,
The Native American vampire is a cyclops. It's
oh wow,
has one eye. Very, very few tales of vampires in folklore turning into bats. Most often, it's usually either a wolf or a rat, or even insects. There are some small instances where they do turn into a bat, but the vampire bat is not a native of Europe. So the European folk people, they didn't know anything about a blood drinking bat.
right,
But there's different and of course, I mean, I don't keep up with all the fiction. You have the nonsensical stuff like the Twilight vampires, that have pizza parties and glow in the dark and use skateboards, and that's a part of that that's better left forgotten. Really, the vampire in almost all folklores was not a sexy or attractive creature. It was usually a ghastly living corpse. There was nothing attractive about him. That really started with Lugosi.
right,
That started and it went on to Christopher Lee, probably even a little bit more.
yeah,
And there's been others down through the ages, but the sexy vampire is a Hollywood creation. There's no real equivalent of it in folklore. They're usually pretty horrible. But yeah, I couldn't even pretend to be an authority in all the vampire stuff. I know more than Joe Blow, but it would take the study of a lifetime to nail it all down. I'm sure Native American vampire. I'm sure tribe by tribe, it probably.
Yeah. That's the thing too. People always think of, the Native American folklore says this. Well, which one? There were so many tribes. They all had their own folklore.
Yeah, there was there was a huge difference between the ones on the plains and the ones that would live in the Northwest on the coast that would actually hunt whales.
Yeah.
That's not something you think of when you think of an Indian.
No.
Somebody that hunts whale, but it happened.
Oh, yeah.
The Inca and the South American indigenous vampires were also pretty horrible, pretty nasty. That's where they have the link to bats, is with the Incans and the Mayans.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they have a bat god called Camazotz for the Mayans or the Incans. You're gonna have to give me a rain check. I don't know which one, but the Camazotz was like creature of the night that ruled all the supernatural beings. So they were the ones that really started out with linking the vampires and the bats. But yeah, and then of course you add in modern fiction, and everybody puts their own spin on it.
Right, which I think is interesting, and I think if you're going to do it, you shouldn't just do a total carbon copy of anything else that's out there. You need to put your own spin on it.
Well, yeah, it's good to have a twist on it. Sometimes it turns out to be a bad twist.
Yeah, like glittery, glowing vampires.
That's it.
I can't get behind Twilight vampires. I wasn't overly crazy about Lost Boys myself either, but
no, I it wasn't with me. Now Near Dark.
Oh, Near Dark is an awesome movie.
That was kind of to me is one of the top 10, if not top 5 vampire films, because it was gritty and dark in a way, but it still had the mythology of creatures of the night that fed on human blood.
The sad part is they came out about the same time as Lost Boys, and everybody knows Lost Boys. It's always on TV. You can find it everywhere. Near Dark just sort of disappeared.
It has a very strong cult following. The people,
right? But you can't find it streaming anywhere. It's not on any of the streaming services. I've looked for years. I've only ever found really expensive DVD or Blu-ray copies.
I'll have to. That might be due to the company that it's on, because sometimes I'll have to look on Tubi, because Tubi has just about everything I found. That's where I was watching Curse of the Undead.
Oh, really?
Earlier.
I haven't watched Tubi much. I should maybe do that some more.
It's free, and I really, I've got streaming services. Roku. I think Roku is the best thing I've ever got.
Wow, I've never gotten that. Literally, the only streaming service we have is Amazon Prime, and
this I haven't paid a dime for anything I've seen on Roku so far.
Wow.
And it really keeps you Tubi has got great genre stuff on it. It's got probably more than I can think of, but there's a one called Movie Time that's really good. They have always the very best prints. Canopy is a really good one, but I ought to try to look for Near Dark on Tubi, see if they got it.
I remember when Tubi was first getting popular, I remember trying it, and the interface was incredibly hard to deal with. It was like if you wanted to look for a TV episode, they had it listed. Each episode was listed individually. You couldn't go through by the series and just go episode 1, then episode 2.
They sure cured that. One of the things there that I recently, they also have a lot of great old obscure TV shows. I've been watching Space 1999 recently, nice. And you can look it up. You go into the main Space 1999 page, and then you can look it up season, episode by episode, and click on the one you want.
Oh, they must have fixed that interface.
It's very very easy. I mean, I watched an episode of Man from Atlantis a month ago on
I
Tubi.
remember that show. I used to like that.
Yeah, the Logan's Run TV show, the weekly one.
Oh yeah.
They got that on there. I honestly, I haven't even really scratched the surface of it, but for horror movies of all kinds, it's a great resource. I mean, they got them right up from the silence right up to the present day,
Oh,
uh,
wow.
and you don't pay anything. I mean, eventually, I might get like Criterion Channel, which is really good. Uh, I might get one just to watch for wrestling stuff because I like that. But as far as old vampire movies of all kinds, another one from the 50s that I really like was just called The Vampire. And it was a very unique, different take on it and a low budget movie, but a great low budget movie. Um, it's the first one that ever portrayed a scientific vampire. It was created by science, by taking the wrong pills.
Oh
Um,
wow.
and the guy, he was like the town doctor, beloved by everybody, the nicest guy you could ever get. He wound up taking one of these pills, and at night, like around 11 o'clock, he turned into like this slobbering Neanderthal sort of beast-like vampire, like a Mr. Hyde more, and it really didn't use any. It used almost none of the supernatural aspects. They turned him into an Atom Age vampire, kind of like a vampire for the Atomic Age, and it's very impressive for the movie it is. The dialogue was good. The guy that played the main part was terrific. It showed just what you can do with a little money. You don't need a big budget. You just have to have a well written kind of a show. But
And a lot
really,
of imagination.
a lot of imagining. You didn't see this vampire until close to the end. You knew it was not the suave guy in the cape. That's for sure. And so, some of the scenes for the time, for the late 50s, there were a couple that were pretty brutal for the time. And I saw it when I was a young kid on WGN. I'd get up at like at 2 in the morning and not make any noise and turn on the TV low and turn the aerial and watch all these old monster movies. My parents never even knew about it. And that one had a couple of scenes that really jolted me. Um, but yeah, I recommend that highly if you can find it. I know it's on Tubi right now, and it's part of a DVD. It's like one of those midnight movies where they got two shows
Oh yeah, yeah.
for the price of one, and they put it with another kind of good late 50s low budget movie called The Return of Dracula, which is also kind of a unique tale. It's Dracula gets chased out of Romania by the communists.
Huh.
Once they find out there's a vampire, they relentlessly hunt him down. So he decides to come over to a small town in the United States, small town California. Kills a guy, and he finds the guy's ID and takes over his identity. Becomes Cousin Belloc,
Oh
and
wow.
like that. And again, it's kind of a unique take on the vampire because he's this time is very suave, sophisticated, with a business suit and a fedora, but still pretty evil character when it came down to it. It was a black and white movie that had one scene in color.
Oh
When,
nice.
when one of the vampires gets staked, the all goes to colors, so the blood, they see the blood, and that was kind of an interesting moment for a black and white movie. But yeah, those are two that they're different than the Hammer vampire films or the Universal. They both try something a little different, and I think we're kind of successful with it. But yeah, I don't know what the last decent vampire show in general release was. Um, there was one called Daybreakers.
Oh, I
That
remember that one.
it was one where the vampires took over the world, basically,
Yeah.
and they had they turned everything mainstream. But the humans would have to come and give so much blood, but
Right, right.
they wouldn't die. I mean, the vampires were all the heads of industry and politics, but if the humans left them alone, they didn't bother them. If they gave their well, I think there's some sort of disease came and started wasting, and they had to rely on the regular humans to get out of it. And I haven't seen it in a while, but boy, I thought that was an original. It showed what would happen if the vampires were the natural order, if they took over everything.
I I remember one that I really am incredibly fond of. I think it's probably my favorite vampire movie. Maybe a little more obvious is John Carpenter's Vampires,
Mm-hmm.
which I don't know. I think what I love about that is how it's sort of there's a especially the vibe right at the beginning of the movie, which to me reminds me a little bit of what happens in the movie Aliens, in that you've got these guys who are just total professional vampire killers. It's what they do for a living. They've got all this tech, they use it, they go out and kill the vampires, and they get just slaughtered. And I like that that's sort of the same way with the Marines going in thinking this is going to be a bug hunt, and they wind up getting just wiped out. And I think that sort of overconfidence thing really works for me for some reason.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you had macho vampire killers, in other words,
Yeah,
instead of ones like Dr. Van Helsing that took all the precautions.
right. Well, I mean, you've seen John Carpenter's Vampires, right?
It's been a long time. Been
Well,
probably
they got tech. They've got like on their trucks, they've got these things that shoot out like a catapult, but it's a stake, and they've got like guns that shoot stakes, and I mean they've got all this tech, and they like stake them and then rope them and pull them out into the sunlight.
yeah. You eventually wind up being probably feeling a little sorry for the vampires.
Well, no, not after, because that's just the very first opening scene, and then they don't find the master of the nest, and he comes for them, and then suddenly it's changed.
Yeah,
They're no longer the masters. They're on the run. What few of them remain?
yeah. I remember. It's been quite some time since I seen that one. Yeah, I'm trying to think of what would you say was your all time favorite vampire
That
film?
would be it. John
That
Carpenter's
would be it. You like
Yeah.
that? I'm kind of torn. There was a Hammer one I really liked called The Brides of Dracula. It was in the classic mode, but boy, it was really classic. And Peter Cushing, he was the best Dr. Van Helsing ever.
Yeah,
I,
he was real good at it.
I liked a lot of them. I liked Anthony Hopkins, Van Helsing, who was a little on the crazy side. Edward Van Sloan, the original Dr. Van Helsing, he was very good for his time. But Peter Cushing, to me, you can't beat him in just about anything.
No, that's true.
I never see. I may see him in a movie that's bad, but I've never seen a performance by him that wasn't good. And his Dr. Van Helsing, particularly in that movie, was the one to me that set the standard for that character. Uh, but yeah, I can't think of the last. I'm sure there's a bunch of direct to video stuff that comes out, most of which is not worth that much.
No.
But I can't think of the last major release in the theaters that dealt with the subject. Uh,
Yeah, I think vampires kind of went cold for a while. And then
well,
they come
the
back to
Twilight,
Twilight.
killed them off.
Yeah.
They need to me, I always said they need to go back to the source and make them ugly and they need to get rid of the sexy vampire.
Oh, 20, what's that? 30 Days of Night or whatever that one.
Yeah,
That one's really good.
Yeah, it was a little bit too CG for me and sub stuff. The concept was very original.
Right.
Back that's the vampire's playground when they have it's night and the sun never comes up.
Although they got the number of days wrong for there, but
that was a stupid mistake to make.
Yeah, because I think it's more like 68 days, something like that.
Yeah. But well, I give them credit for original concept. That originally started as a comic.
Right.
That was a comic.
Right, and I've never read the comic book. I've just seen the movie, and I enjoyed the movie a lot. Apparently there are several sequels which I have not seen.
I would say, judging by most of them, you probably ain't missing much. There are very few sequels ever equal up to the original.
I guess they're doing a new version of Salem's Lot. Be interesting to see.
Yeah. That's another. Now you bring it up. That's another big favorite of mine.
Oh, that's a really good one.
TV miniseries. Yeah, that. Now that you come to think of it, that might be my favorite.
And I've been interested in rewatching that for months. I've got a DVD box set that has The Shining and It and that Salem's Lot on it, and I've been meaning to watch Salem's Lot again, and I haven't. I need to dig that up and do it.
They do have Salem's Lot on Tubi as well.
Oh wow!
The original one, and I'm probably going to rewatch it pretty soon. That's a big favorite of mine. I remember watching that. Even my dad didn't like horror movies, but even he was interested in watching some of that.
That's a great book too.
It had a lot of. It's quite different than the TV series, your TV miniseries, but they both had their good points. I usually don't like it when they change too much from the source material, but that was a case where it worked. The changes they made worked for me. So yeah. I'm glad you reminded me of that. That's a good one.
Maybe you might want to talk. You do some articles for a horror website, and also you do some stuff for Wormwood. Maybe you want to talk about both of those projects.
Well, the horror website I write for is called Ravenous Monster. It's been around now, I'd say about 10 years at least, maybe more. It's helmed by a guy that also writes for Wormwood, Jason Thorson, who's Thor in Wormwood. And I just had a new article, which is my kind of like review and look at the 1973 miniseries called Frankenstein: The True Story, which was one of my favorites from the time. So that just
I've been wanting to see that again.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite versions of the Frankenstein story, even though it takes liberties with it. At its heart, it's probably the most faithful because the original Frankenstein story is nothing but a tragedy. It's a Greek tragedy, and that's what this movie is as well. Is just a tragic story. But there's a lot of different reviews. Ravenous Monster, of course, reviews of videos and movies, but also TV series, books, games. I mean, I even did a review of an album by the band Goblin.
Oh, nice.
Who they do all the soundtracks to the Italian Giallo movies. So that's something I write for from time to time. The one that I'm in charge of or run is Wormwood Chronicles. And that's kind of eclectic. It's got a lot of heavy metal stuff, tons of reviews, band interviews, but not exclusively. We'll do progressive rock, punk rock, strange electronic soundscape stuff. We'll do movies. I'm in the middle right now of writing a story about Cameron Mitchell, the guy who was pegged to be an Academy Award winning actor and wound up being the ultimate exploitation actor.
Oh wow.
And yeah, he was like John Carradine. He was a guy that if you offered him a movie part, he didn't know how to say no to it. He'd appear in just about anything. So that's a current one, but I mean, there's stories about the paranormal. That's where the original vampire article that you're printing appeared.
Right.
And that was a few years back. I've kind of veered off. I want to make sure when I write one of those, it's on something that hasn't been done to death. Doing the typical Bigfoot and Loch Ness monster stuff, unless I can find something new to add to it, I won't be doing much of that. But maybe the more obscure creatures, obscure cryptids. I've written about the Chinese Yeren, which is their equivalent of Bigfoot, but yet it's not really the same. I wrote about the Gloucester sea serpent from the early 1800s, which was a sea serpent that was seen by so many people that they'd actually have picnic lunches out to watch him cavort in the water. So it's kind of odd. Just go to wormwoodchronicles.net and you'll see you've got a ton of stuff up there.
Yeah, I write for anybody looking, I write under the name Dark Star there.
Yeah, and it's quite a strange crew we have working for it. So that's something you can look into. And I'm probably the least talented person that works for it. I mean, we have all sorts of musicians and published writers and guys that work for real print magazines, which Wormwood used to be, but isn't anymore. So just check it out if you want. Just put in Wormwood Chronicles in your search engine. Put in Ravenous Monster in your search engine. And also, I got articles up under my real name at Music Street Journal.
Yep.
And that kind of covers pretty much what I'm doing right now.
Yeah. Just checking on the time. We got a little time left. If you got anything else you'd like to talk about,
I think we hit it pretty good. Covered a lot of the vampiric stuff. Of course, it's a subject that never gets exhausted.
No, that's for sure. I know I know when I first got into vampires. For me, it was Dark Shadows. I remember I was one of those kids who would rush home from school every day to watch Dark Shadows and Barnabas, and then I went to Kolchak Night Stalker, obviously, which that's a passion you and I both share.
Oh, well, that's the same thing with me. I remember when I was very, very young. I remember when Dark Shadows was on, and Barnabas Collins was a cult hero. He was a pop hero. People now, unless they've heard of it and others, or they think of the movie with Johnny Depp, which has
right.
got very little to do with. I have to say, when I go back and I watch some of those now, they don't hit me the same way as when I was a kid.
I've tried watching some episodes, and wow, they are so 1960s soap opera. I mean, it's poorly flow and poorly acted, and
some of it. Although Jonathan Frid,
he was brilliant.
Collins was great. Some of the other guys, Thayer David was good on it. The guy that was Quentin Collins, the werewolf, he was pretty good himself. They had some breathtakingly beautiful women on that show.
I recently picked up a DVD of House of Dark Shadows, but I haven't watched it yet. Which I don't know if you know, they filmed that at the same time the show was going on.
They compressed that the story into the movie.
Right, but they also apparently changed him from being sort of a reluctant vampire to being very much more of a typical vampire monster.
He was a villain, and by the end of the show, now he had a sympathetic edge, which a lot of vampires do have that. But no, he was a villain in the movie. So that I remember, and of course, Kolchak is my all-time favorite fictional character. Any kind.
Oh, he's brilliant.
Yeah, the two movies, the Night Stalker and the Night Strangler, they really redefined horror movies for a new generation.
I think at one time Night Stalker had the highest ratings of any TV movie.
It had for a long time.
Well into
the late 90s. It was the number one rated TV movie.
Yeah.
That was true. That's why it always baffled me. The movies were just plowed up incredible ratings, yet the TV show only lasted a year. If it would have lasted 2 years, Kolchak would be bigger than Star Trek.
Oh, I think so. Part of it was Darren McGavin was not happy because he wound up saddled with a lot of work that he wasn't being paid for or credited for because
he pulled the plug on it himself.
Yeah, there were people telling him, "Well, go to the network, ask them to renew it. They'll do it if you try hard enough." And he's like, "No, I don't want to."
Yeah. Well, there was fighting behind the scenes, and there was a lot of. He wanted to take it in a slightly different direction, which wound up being more of what the X-Files did.
Right, which I remember they wanted. Chris Carter was hugely influenced by Kolchak.
Yeah.
And in fact, he wanted to have Kolchak appear in an episode, and Darren McGavin refused to play the character again, so he wrote him as a different character.
Yeah. He was one of the weathermen or something
like that. Yeah.
No, it was good to see him, but they tried a remake of it, and it was just one of the most horrible things I've ever seen.
I think I remember trying to watch it, and it was pretty bad.
I've seen a lot of bad remakes, but that one was so bad it buried itself. I mean, a lot of times, nobody's gonna. Sometimes I'm open to new actors playing, but nobody's gonna beat Darren McGavin.
No, he was brilliant.
And nobody's gonna be better Vincenzo than Simon Oakland.
Oh yeah, no kidding.
They were. My dad didn't like monster movies and horror stuff, but he loved the Night Stalker because of Darren McGavin and Simon Oakland, and it was funny as hell.
The interplay between the two of them, oh my God.
Yeah. They had like one time Vincenzo said, I often thought in my younger days that I would be a priest. And then Kolchak said, and then the Inquisition ended and all the fun went out of it for you.
They had such a good.
Oh, yeah. Kolchak could say, well, what's wrong with my hat? Kolchak would say, what's under it?
And I love it. Miss Emily brought him back a new hat. He didn't wear it.
Yeah,
that's another one. I've tried to find that hat, one that matches it. You can find it. They're like $200 for a hat.
Yeah, they are. I've seen them online. I would like to get one. Really,
I would too. I would wear that like crazy.
I'd like to get one, but it's just a financial thing. But
not at that price.
Yeah. I'd probably pay up to $75 to get one.
I haven't seen one even that low.
I wouldn't go over 100. I wouldn't go over 100. I think up in Madison at the Sacred Feather Hat Shop they had one.
So if anyone watches this and can make some Kolchak replica hats, please think of Mike and myself.
I'll get it. I mean, nothing's going to make me look good, but at least I feel better wearing that. But I think we covered quite a bit of ground.
I think we've had some fun with this. This was good. I figured we'd have a good time. We always do.
Thank you very much for.
Yeah, let me just remind everybody, Lifeblood 2, where you will find Mike's article and a lot of other great stuff. You can get it at lulu.com/spotlight/strange sound. Or if you go to GaryHillAuthor.com and go to the Tales of Wonder and Dread pages, you'll find the link. But those links, one of them will say Lulu, that gets you to the paperback. One of them will say hardcover, that gets you to the hardcover. They just take you to Lulu to buy them anyway. So
I will second that motion.
all right. Well, take it easy, Mike. Thank you for being on here. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And that's it.
Okay. Thanks, Gary.
All right. Take care.
You bet.
Spooky Ventures is the home for spooky content and spooky merchandise on the web. Check it out today at spookyventures.com. And remember, always keep it spooky.